turn their profit on.
Yeah.
That's what we were just saying. Well, that's it, yeah, I was like, yep. All right. All right, let's see here. Good to have everybody with us this morning, those who are here. Those who are online with us, and I should just take a picture of the, turn real quick, everybody see the auditorium and say, yep, I think everybody got their clocks backwards today. So,
A lot of times you think you have all this time.
yeah, that's right, that's what happens. People think, oh, we got a whole hour extra, we're good, we're good. I said this morning, 6 o'clock this morning came as fast as it did yesterday, so it didn't really matter to me. I'll tell you. It's the same thing. All right, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 6. Of course, we're going to be dealing with the lion's den this morning. And we'll be finishing up, actually, Daniel this morning, and then we'll move into, I believe it was Matthew. We'll be talking about Jesus after this, so we'll be going back and forth through different gospel accounts. But this morning, we are, as we stated, we are going to be here in Daniel. We're going to deal with this, begin here with Daniel chapter 6 with the drill. And the drills are, let me see, name the first 14 books of the New Testament. So you just keep naming, don't worry about counting, I'll tell you when to stop. So we'll do that. Everyone's like Matthew, Mark, Luke. So go ahead. Boom, you got it. That's it. Our first, 2 Thessalonians. That's what I was looking for. That's 14. Good job. Good job. Everybody here kept going. All right, we got to start at Genesis. Work our way up and see how everybody does. Go from there forward. And then we'll do them backwards. All right, so everyone's like, no, I don't think so. That's like always amazing when someone says, okay, say the alphabet backwards. I'm like, are you kidding me? So, all right, so let's go ahead and look at our question. Just kind of remind where we are, what's going on. Daniel chapter 2, of course, with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It states this, the question, who, according to Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, would set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed? God, that's exactly right. God said he would set up his kingdom, and we know that kingdom would be a kingdom that would be through Jesus, would be the head of that kingdom, and we find all that with that, which brings us into our next two questions. And as Daniel chapter 3, the fiery furnace, everybody's very familiar about that. And it says, what did Nebuchadnezzar build on the plain of Dura? Daniel 3:1. What did he build? What was the main thing in that story besides the fiery furnace?
The golden image.
The golden image, just right, the statue. The golden image, the statue that was there that people were to bow down to and worship. And we see that, and of course we know Daniel's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said that ain't happening. And so it was great to see how they stood for God. God took care of them. Next one, how many men did King Nebuchadnezzar see in the fiery furnace? Where he threw 3 in, but how many were in there? He saw 4. He said he saw 3 and 1 walk around like the Son of Man. And so most people represent it being Jesus, of course. And Daniel, we look at that and we go, was it an angel? Was it Jesus? When you say it like that, Daniel was writingly inspired. We say, well, more like it was probably Jesus. And we see that. And regardless, God was taking care of them throughout it. And we see that. Which brings us to Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar's pride. Question, how could Nebuchadnezzar save himself from God's punishment? How could he save himself?
He told him to break off your sins by being righteous and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor.
That's exactly right. So in other words, it's repenting of everything you've done wrong, and you need to start showing mercy to the poor. And for God to say that, to make that, tell Daniel that basically is what it's showing us, is he must have been horrible to the poor. He must have been really bad. But it's kind of interesting, though. You go to the New Testament, that's one of the commands also there in the New Testament that we see for us. Repent of things when we sin, but also taking care, it says, the widows and the poor, and we understand that, or of course the orphans, and also reference poor throughout the Bible. So think about that. So that's exactly right. And it took them a while to get there. It said 7 times, and we're not sure if that was seasons, years, months, whichever it may be. And most people lean toward years, and they're like, well, how did he get his kingdom back? Well, his son would have had it then when it came back to him, when he was restored. All right, let's go on to the next one. The New Testament books and letters are written to A, individuals, B, churches, or C, both. Both, exactly right. We see letters being written to us individually, without a doubt. We know that there's things we need to think about in this too. And we also know that there are those written to churches. But also in the Bible, you actually see where it's written to individuals like Timothy, Titus, Philemon. We see these areas. And then, of course, we find an understanding of churches themselves. Which brings us to Daniel chapter 5, writing on the wall. It says, at the feast of the king Belshazzar, what cups were used for drinking wine?
The ones that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which was in Jerusalem.
Exactly. So they were from God's house, is what we see the temple. And they weren't supposed to be used for anything like that. Especially, remember, it wasn't as much them using it, but it's what they were using it for. They were toasting to many other false gods, and we see that. And God wasn't going to have that. Which brings us to Daniel 5:6. Describe King Belshazzar's reaction to the handwriting on the wall. Let's look at his face. He's scared to death without a doubt. And there's that word called countenance, and we know that that is his face. Said it changed, and he was really, really afraid, really worried about it, and he started trying to get people to tell him what it meant. And the only one that could tell him what it meant was who? Daniel was the only one. And his the thing of that was that night everything would be over with for the Babylonian Empire. They'd be gone. The Medo-Persian Empire would take over, and we see that. So, all right, so that's where we are in Daniel chapter. There we're dealing still with this area about 539 BC. That was Daniel in the lion's den last week. Tonight, Daniel in the lion's den today. Today that we're going to look at. We go ahead and remember where we are. We're over here still in this area of Babylon because they've taken over this area, and this is where Daniel and everybody's at. The Medes and the Persians didn't come in and say, hey, let's move somewhere else. Babylon was a great place, there was a lot to it, and they wanted to take it over, and it was a big, huge kingdom, and so palace and so on. We saw that 12 square miles. Everybody remembers how high did the walls were? Did I say on Wednesday night? Anybody remember that? Really tall. Close to about a little over 300 feet high. They were about 330 feet high. You look at it, that's a skyscraper. It's just remarkable. And so, a lot of times we think about nowadays, we go, oh, how amazing we are, scientist-wise and everything. You think they were building stuff like that back then too. And remember, and you're talking about, 80, 90-foot wide walls is what was there. So they thought they were in control. Nothing had happened to them at all, and we know that wasn't the case. All right, so let's get into here. Let's get to Daniel Lion's Den, chapter 6. Here we find, basically, both chapter 3 and chapter 6 kind of play on each other. What I mean by that, they're instances of God's deliverance. God's deliverance for all the people, for the people that are following Him, looking to Him. We know chapter 3 was the fiery furnace, the deliverance of the three. And here we're going to see the deliverance of Daniel himself in a lion's den. Most lion's dens, a human gets thrown in a lion's den, what do you figure is going to happen? They're going to eat them. And these lion's dens that they had, the lion's den wasn't for petting purposes. It wasn't a petting zoo or nothing like that. It wasn't like a thing that occasionally, they would actually, when we read a history, they would actually not feed them as normal as you'd expect fed because they want them to devour humans when they throw them in there. And so we would think they would do that anyways, but they made it farther than that. So in chapter 3, as we said, we saw that there. Now we're in chapter 6 where the Babylonian rule is gone. Babylon had fallen, we saw in verse 30, 31 of chapter 5, and now the Medes and Persians rule. So chapter 6 is saying there are new circumstances, but even though there's new circumstances, a new leader in town, taking everything over, nothing changes for God. Nothing changes for God and for God's people, and those that are following God's people. And that's what we find and understand with that, and how great that is that we see that taking place. Let me make sure I'm online again. I jumped off here for a second. One second here real quick. Let's see it down. Alright, we're still on that. Alright, we're doing good. Alright, so as we see this. So let's go ahead and look at this. We're going to begin at verses 1 and 2. And verses 1 and 2 talks about basically preventing government loss. And everybody knows that government's wasteful. It always has been, and it probably always will be. And it's just terrible. Our own government is probably one of the worst, in the world actually at, wasting money. And it was no different during the time of Nebuchadnezzar or the time of Darius. We see the king, with the Medes and the Persians. That it's just something that always happened. And so it makes sense that you always put people over different things to make sure that that doesn't happen. But even though you put people over things, it still seems to happen. So here we begin verses 1 and 2 with this, with these people known as the satraps and what they're involved in. So let's go ahead and see what we read here about Darius. Daniel 6, 1 through 2, please.
It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these three governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss.
Okay, that was it, verse 1 and 2. All right, so as we see the first two verses, what we've already said, they remind us of large governments and, have always faced the problems of waste, overindulgence, even corruption. And like so we see it in our own. Darius appoints 120 satraps, as we understand, satraps to rule over his kingdom. As it says, there are 3 officials in charge. But the important thing of understanding this is Daniel's part of the 3. So Daniel's very high still, right? Remember, he's 80 years old now. We look at that as 80 years old. And, remember the king, Belshazzar, offered him something. And basically said, you tell me what's happening here. I'll give you a purple robe and give you all these gold chains. And also I'll make you the third overall of the nation, over everything. Because it was him, of course, his dad, and then it would be Daniel. But Daniel, 2 things. Number 1, we say, Daniel, decided, he goes, I don't want any of that. I'll tell you what it is. And people think, well, Daniel's 80, he doesn't need to be in charge of anything anymore. No, I believe what it is, Daniel knew what was about to happen to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He knew what was going to happen to Babylon kingdom with Belshazzar, as we see there at that time. Because when we get here to Darius, we see that Daniel doesn't have a problem being in charge, does he? He's fine with that. And he knew this was the case. So here he is. The satraps were responsible for basically collecting taxes, maintaining the law and order, and raising and maintaining an army. Kind of sounds like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Finance, we have these different things we know throughout our own country. So that's what was all involved there. So that's what the first 2 verses are about. Just telling us, giving us an introduction of what we see here, which brings us to this next point, that Daniel is going to rise to the top. I mean, this is nothing new for Daniel. God's constantly taking care of Daniel as long as Daniel is what? Faithful to God. And we don't see anywhere, we see nowhere through the story of Daniel not being faithful. We always see him faithful throughout it. And that's always from a young man to where he's at today. And, and he's been in captivity the whole time, right? Since when he went to, the land of Babylon as a young man with Zechariah, he's been in captivity all this time. And he's still faithful to God. He's still looking to God, and God is taking care of him. So let's go ahead and read this verses 3 through 4 and see here where Daniel basically is, rises to the top of what's going on here. If someone read that for us, please.
Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him.
Thank you. So here we find Daniel with this, we know that God gave Daniel the ability, of course, to interpret dreams. We've seen that throughout this. But the excellent spirit that set Daniel apart from everything is his godly character. That's what it all is. It's all about his godly character. Daniel's character is clearly a central theme in this chapter that we're going to find in another chapter throughout the whole book, basically, when it comes down to it. But you think about this. Daniel was not only faithful to God, he was faithful to the king, meaning, as the Bible talks about, we're looking at governments and so on. And but if anything went beyond that, it was something different from that God allowed, what would Daniel say to the king or the government? How you doing it? How you doing it? And I want you to notice something here very important, because we see this throughout history with kingdoms, being destroyed, kingdoms lasting so long, and then things happening to them. We see this that every time throughout the Bible, God has always made it very clear: if you're faithful to me, I'll take care of you. Now that doesn't mean that someone's going to die. Someone's not going to die from the government. That can happen. We've seen that throughout the Roman Empire with Christians. We know. But here's the thing, you and I today, has it changed today? Do we still need to be faithful to God? Without a doubt. And God says, if you're faithful to me, I'll protect you, and that may be physically, that may be certain things, that may be spiritually. But without a doubt, here's where it comes to. If our government decides we're not going to do anything by God anymore, we're going to change, and you have to do it. If you decide to follow Jesus, look to Jesus, try to get together to worship, we're going to destroy you, and that's the way it's going to be. What do? Do we give in? No, we just continue to worship God, don't we? We continue to do the same thing we're doing today as Christians. And that's what we see, and it's so important for us to find that. So we see all this happening, all these other commissioners, these satraps that would take place during this time, trying to find any evidence of corruption in Daniel's governance. And we read that just a moment ago, and as we just saw there, as we see that. But I think what's great about this is here it is. We talk about every government you see has corruption, problems on it. But Daniel's section, whoever he was over, whatever was going on, they went through the books very carefully. Kind of be like the IRS, I guess. And they found nothing. I guarantee you, if they would have found a period, a comma, something out of place, something wrong, they would have used whatever they could to say Daniel was wrong, that he was bad, that he was unfaithful to the king, that Darius, that he wasn't doing what needed to be right. And guess what? We said once again, they found nothing. So we know the whole story that since they didn't find anything, we're going to try to make something up. We're going to find something to cause a problem because they knew where Daniel stood with his God. So with all this happening, they went over to this apartment, nothing at all. And, he was what Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3:2 would call blameless, without reproach. Now, word blameless, when we hear it, it sounds like it means perfect, but it's not. Daniel was a human being, just like you and I. We know there's only been one perfect individual on this earth. And remember, Daniel right now, even though they're not with the temple, he's still under the law of Moses, and we see that. And, Jesus lived and died under the law, and he was the only one that kept the whole law perfect. And so it's really interesting to see that what Daniel was doing was blameless without reproach. In other words, what that means is nobody could come up to him and say, I know what you think you are about your God. Remember what you did last week? And we don't see that happening at all. So as we look at this, we need to really appreciate verses like these that we read here. Because we live in a world today that people often, try to argue that everyone, basically that everyone is kind of living a double life. That they're one way here, but they're different here. And, and we see that's not the way Christians are to be. In fact, such sterling character is not to be the rare exception of Christians, but it's supposed to be the norm, really, when it comes down to it. In fact, that's what we read in this verse here. If someone would go and read for us Philippians 2, verse 15, please.
That you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world.
Now think about that right there. That's very clear. Paul was dealing with those of Philippi. They were still dealing with the Roman Empire, a lot of problems persecuting Christians. And now even, and get a little bit farther through this, there were some elders in the church starting to persecute the church themselves because they were wolves, in sheep clothing. And you also had another group persecuting the church. Who was the other group persecuting the church that most of these Christians came from? The Jews. The Jews, exactly right. And so we see that. So they were being actually taunted on all sides. It was just crazy what was going on, what was taking place. And for that to happen, you think Paul would be like, just do your best, do your best. So he does. He says, become blameless, become harmless, children of God without fault. And there it is. He's not saying, I know you're not going to be perfect, but stand up for God in every moment and chance you get. And stand up for Jesus. And that's what we see happening here. So as we look at this taking place, when we bring this back to Daniel, this is exactly who Daniel was, everything with it, which brings us to this thought here, the law of God. God does have a law. We know under the old law that Daniel was under the Mosaic law. Now, they couldn't keep the whole Mosaic law right now because we don't know if they were able to keep the Sabbath day. We're not sure. The Bible doesn't tell us about that. Babylonian Empire. We do hear that they say certain things about the Jews kind of keeping their ways in the sense of talking about God, talking about the Bible, reminding those there. Remember, there were people being born here that were never in Jerusalem. They were never of Judah, never a part of that. They never saw the temple. The temple's been destroyed. It was caught on fire. The walls were destroyed. We see all this happening. And, and it's mainly the walls, really, and they have to come back and rebuild, which will happen. But I just want us to understand, even when they were there in this captivity, they still needed to follow the law of God to every point they could. And so that's what we see. And Daniel was one of those, which brings us to verse 5. Someone would like to read this. Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, please.
Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God.
Thank you. Now, when they said this, think about this one. They knew Daniel was following the law to the what? We would see to the letter, to the T. You know what I mean? That's that statement saying that we say. He's following it. I mean, and they look at it. So what they need to do is try to figure out a way to make him go against the law of God. They've got to find something that would cause him to do this. You think that we would say, well, maybe they figured out what was going on before, like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They may have never heard about that, because remember, this is a new kingdom. This is a totally different kingdom. And remember, even Darius, we go back to Belshazzar. Belshazzar didn't even know Daniel, did he? I mean, he said, you know, his wife had it, not his wife, his mother, well, yeah, the mother queen, we would say, had to tell him about him. And he acted like, yeah, I've heard about you, you know, for a long time. And that wasn't the case whatsoever. So when we look at this here, we think about this, we know, they know how Daniel is, that he's following everything his Lord, that God says. But they don't really know, Daniel, how far he'll go to follow God, even losing his life. It's the way, he's fine with that. He just knows he's right with God. So Daniel's enemies truly, we understand, they these other two, you know, with him and satraps, probably many others, they hated him. They hated him. Number one, just because of the way things were going for him, but also very important, number two, he is not a Mede or a Persian. Remember, he's a Jewish man. And it's like, why should a Jewish man be over Medes or Persians? And that's just the way it's going to be. And, you know, Darius knew what he had in Daniel. He understood where Daniel stood with God. He understood the blessings that came with that and saw that. So, you know, here we find that the only way to get Daniel into trouble with the kings is set up a situation in which Daniel must make a choice between obeying God or obeying man. And that's the choice he gives him. So we need to be impressed, you know, with that. Not only is Daniel's faith already noticed, he's not only keeping his faith, but everybody around him knows about his faith, don't they? Because they read this up there again, think about that, what you're saying. They all know about Daniel's faith, or they wouldn't have said that concerning the law of his God that we see here. And remember, when they say his God, it's because only the Jews were really following God. We know Nebuchadnezzar did to a point. We're seeing here, Darius is going to figure it out too. And we're not going to go past chapter 6 in Daniel with this study, but we will see more later as we go back a little bit to Nebuchadnezzar, then back to this area here. So, you know, it is the reputation really that comes about that Daniel has with all the people there in that area, all his community, and it comes to us today the same thing. You know, what reputation do we have in the community? And that's what we need to look at. That's kind of what's being taught here. You know, do people think, you know, that everybody, even Christians, have a breaking point? Now, don't think I'm saying that Christians are perfect. We all know we're going to sin. But we need to understand that when people try us or try to get us to, you know, do something wrong against God, they need to be able to look at us and go, you're not going to be able to get him or her to do that. They're faithful to God. You're just not going to be able to get it done. And that'd be the great thing, for them to just leave you alone, you know, and not do that because of that. But when we are tested, that means someone's not sure. And that means we need to pass the test. And we see that with God as we find. So here's Daniel. Daniel's doing all this. And Daniel, we don't read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego anymore. We don't know, you know, if they're dead or what's going on here. But in a sense, when Daniel's at the top with these other two and with the king, you know, Daniel's kind of alone. And this picture's not Daniel, that's more of the king. You know, Daniel's alone. He's alone with what's going on, or more of these satraps, I guess you'd actually say, are the ones in charge of them, which brings us Daniel 6 through 9. Let's go ahead and see what it says and what it tells us about that. If someone will go and read this for us, please.
So these governors and satraps were thrown before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever.
I'm going to stop just a second, Greg, right there. So Greg, everybody think about this. The first thing they do is they try to build the king up. You know, King Darius, live forever. You know, I mean, you're the man, you know, trying to build up his pride and everything there. Because of what they're about to say. Remember, Darius, we know, he likes Daniel. He gets along with it. In fact, we know that he's, you know, younger than Daniel. And we see this here. You know, he's about, the Bible says about, you know, 60s, young 60s, I guess you'd say. And so with all that happens. So Greg, go ahead and continue to read for us, please.
All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, and the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions.
There you go.
Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Adair, sign the written decree.
Thank you. So here he signs this decree. Now what's interesting, if you remember, let's think back to this moment, that Daniel has been so useful, diligent, faithful to God, and also Darius, that you think back to Daniel 6 verse 3 that we said, notice, Darius' plan was to put Daniel in charge of everything. And so notice, I'll read it again, and this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. That's what set these people off. It's like he's not just over part of the Medes and Persians. Now he's going to be over who?
I'll be all.
Everybody. So before you can even, really, and when someone's like that in that position, really when it comes down to it, before you can even usually get to the king, who do you have to go to? The one that's been put in charge over all the promise, like a governor over everybody, or, you know, and we see this. So these men know now they're not only going to answer the king, they're going to answer to Daniel first. And Daniel has the authority to tell them, no, you're not going to talk to the king, and this is what's going to happen. And that really bothered them because they don't have his ear anymore. And, you know, it had all to do with power, strength, you know, prestige, and what we see here. So Daniel, a Hebrew, becomes, you know, very hateable, I guess the best way to say it. And just like we saw with the wise men of Babylon and toward Daniel, the entire Persian bureaucracy puts their heads together and comes before the king with this terrible moment of what they want done. They appeal to his vanity, as we just said a moment ago, by suggesting that every citizen can only pray to him. And there's by thinking, oh my God. You know what I mean? And this is where Darius gets in trouble in a sense because of what's going to happen to Daniel. When you start thinking only about yourself, other people get hurt. And it really does. And so they reinforced this law by adding the penalty for disobedience is death in the lion's den. Notice, they knew the lion's den wasn't a place just to play. It was death, regardless when you hit there. And that it would be impossible, even for the king to revoke this law once it was signed in the land. We go, why? Why can't he do that? Because notice that verse they said, according to the Medes and Persians. See, when we look at history, we know always, according to the Medes and Persian system, laws once enacted could never be revoked, not even by the king himself. You know what I mean? I imagine some people, you know, just would love to see that happen, to be able to do that in our own country, other countries, without a doubt. And here we see this happening here. And you know, when the king signed it, he probably wasn't thinking about Daniel, was he, at that moment?
It made him mad.
No, it made him mad. Probably made him angry. He probably like, no. What he's thinking about is just, ooh, I'm already the king, but now I'm going to be bigger than that. Because everybody's going to pray to me. Because they're used to praying gods, but not the king, but now this is going to happen. So the logical deduction is that the Persian king is a god on earth, a representative God, then his decree ought to be irrevocable. That's what they're getting at here, and that's what we see with the Persian Medes laws. If we wonder why the king, you know, would sign such a law, think about the statement, there is something intoxicating for people about being the sole channel to the gods, or the surrogate deity, or so on. You know what I mean? You know, I don't want to bash anybody in other religion. I'm not going to ever do that because I pray they come to the truth one day. But, you know, Catholicism, that's what the Pope believes. You know, that's what they treat the Pope as, that he is a God on earth. And, you know, that he has the last say-so. Or he can say, this is what we're going to do from now on because I've stated this and it comes from God. And, you know, and that's where, you know, that's just too much into that. You can't be like that. That can't happen. And we have perfect stories like this about Daniel that show us and make it very clear. So the fact that they make sure the king has no wiggle room may infer that they suspected that once they come to him and say, guess what, King, Daniel isn't doing this, that he would try to do what with the law? Try to change it, try to reverse it. And they're making it very clear that that can never, ever happen. So with all the underlying, you know, things happening here, everything buried down in the administration, it was like, bam, there it is, this is in place. And what amazes me is here is Daniel, third in control right now. It shows us how far Darius' mind was. He didn't even ask, where's Daniel on this? Notice that. Because if Daniel would have been there, what would he probably say? That ain't ever happening with me. And he just said straightforward. Me or many of the other Jews, we're not doing that. You're crazy. And remember, they're not going after the other Jews right now. They're just going after Daniel. But we've said it before, even under Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, once you get the head guy, and if you can get him, you're going to start going after all the little ones. That's without a doubt, and we see that. So here's Daniel. Here's what happened. When Daniel finally knew, when he realized what happened, Daniel's going to give in, isn't he? Daniel's finally going to give in, right? He's going to give in to the king. No, he's not going to give in to the king. Of course not. He's going to give in to his own king, and that is God. And, as we see this at this point, which brings us to verse 10, let's go and read what it says. Someone read that for us, please.
Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days.
Thank you. Now, we see here, we wonder, how did Daniel find out? Well, Daniel is, third, and they have to tell him so he can pass it down to all of his other people. And from there, when Daniel found this, he's like, oh, I got to go home and just think about this for a while and figure what's going to happen. That's not what he did. He went home and he goes, what? Watch this. Watch this. I'll show them. No, that's not what it is either. He's telling God, God, you're the only one I worship. You're the only one I look to. And whenever anybody goes against you, that's just not going to happen. You think about this, if Hollywood was, doing a movie about this chapter, they probably would picture Daniel as really struggling, walking back and forth in his home, just like, what do I do, what do I do, what do I do, what do I do, what happens here? But we know it's not the case. Daniel didn't have any problem struggling with it. It says he went straight home and didn't just pray to God, open his windows up. And people might say, oh, that's just being boastful or prideful. No, it says that was a common thing that he did. For notice, look behind us again. It says he went to the upper room with the windows open toward Jerusalem. He knelt down on the knees 3 times that day. And we find that this was a custom, it says, since his early days. It was normal for him to do that. So it's not like he was trying to stand out or anything, but also at the same time, I think it was a great thing because everybody could see it. Anybody, because that's all they were waiting for. They had somebody following them, someone looking at, see what's happening. And this is what they wanted. So we read no inner turmoil or anguish, in the mind of Daniel at all. Daniel was able to see the actual issue of what was going on here, facing this, I guess you say, kind of minor religious inconvenience to Daniel. He's like, this is no big deal. I'll just go home and pray to God anyway. And that's how he saw it. But these other people really thought it was going to be a chance to catch him. Which brings us to this thought. I want us to think about this again. Verse 10, we just read it, the power of habit. See, a lot of times we think habit's bad, it's not good. But brother, we need to realize there's 2 sides of habits. There's good habits and there's bad habits. And this was a habit. This was a custom, is what that word means. Custom was a habit for Daniel to do this. He loved to do this. And it's so good for us to form habits that are good and right by God and by Christ. And that's what we find there. So as we see this happening, moving on, routine does not have to become I guess you'd say, kind of like a formalist rut. Because there are those in the religious world that bash him for, why do we take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? What should always be our answer? Why do we? Because there's those that don't, of course. Why do we take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? Because we're commanded. Acts 20 verse 7. It's pretty clear. And we see it. We see other areas where Paul waited to worship with the brethren and to take the Lord's Supper. And we see that. Well, there are those that say, if you do that, you're really, it's not as important. And you're kind of in a rut, just doing the same thing over and over again. Not as important. I think it's more important when you think about that, number 1, because you're remembering what Jesus went through every first day of the week. But number 2, God says do it that way. And this is really what came down to Daniel, what we find with him. So we see this. So Daniel, just continued kneeling, doing what needed to be done. Kneeling is not, of course, the only posture that we have. We see in the Bible people praying to God. Some are prostrate all the way down, on their face praying to God. And I don't know how many here have been on their knees praying before. I don't have a problem saying I have without a doubt. And we know that we see that. And it's just all it is about the allness and respect of God. And that's what Daniel was trying to show. Which brings us to verses 11 through 13. I'm going to go ahead and read that. I only have 3 minutes. All right, folks, hold on. I'm going to read. All right, here we go. All right, so then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not cited the decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Notice what happens here. They don't come and say, hey, guess what, king? Daniel's breaking your law. They remind him of what he said. They haven't said Daniel that, they just said any man, any person basically. And the king answered and said, of course, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Notice, even he understands that. So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So in other words, they're saying, he doesn't pray to you, he prays to his God. And he does it 3 times a day. And he said, this is just the way it is. And what do they expect him to do? Well, they're expecting the king to be mad. And of course he is. It displeased the king in a sense, but not completely, I guess you'd say. Which notice 14 and 15 says this. It says, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. I want you all to catch that. He wasn't displeased with Daniel, was he? He was displeased with himself because he let these men, he let these people pull him into a situation that he had a real hard time, or at all couldn't get out of. And so when it says, and his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He's trying to figure out a way, is what it's saying, to get around the law. Some way to do it. There's no way. There's no way around it at all. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, see, after he thought about it all night, they're probably like, what's he waiting on? What's he waiting on? And they say, no, O king, that is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. So he realizes his foolishness and sees what's happening here. And I think about these 2 verses when we look at this. It says Psalm 146, verse 3 and 4, do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son, a man in whom there is no help. For his spirit departs, he returns to this earth, and that very day his plans perish. In other words, don't put anybody above God. That's what it really is getting at here. And we know verse 16, here, without a doubt, here it is, that we see then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions, and the king declared to Daniel. I love this part. This is to show you something great about the relationship between Darius and Daniel. He says, may your God, whom you serve continually, do what? Deliver you. Keep you safe, deliver you through this, what's going on. And then we have 17:23, block verses here. I'll just read real quick. Let me see. Okay, I got time. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. Notice, it wasn't like you watch that and put it in, no, and there's no way out. Think about it then. We don't know if there's any light in there. It may be pitch black. We just don't know. It says, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, and nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled him from him. He's having a hard time. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den. He's running. He's getting there. He's like, let's get there. Come on, hurry up. And see what happens. You know what it shows here? It shows us that the king actually had a thought in his head with what he said about delivering, that his God would keep him safe. It's exactly right. Would keep him safe. It says, and then the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting, and I already got there. Then at break of day, he arose, went to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. And the king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? I love that part because here's the king yelling out. When the king talks, who listens? Everybody. He doesn't say, oh Daniel, I hope you were strong enough to deal with the lions. He says everything's going to God, credit to God, credit to your God, credit to your God. And that's how Daniel wanted it. It says, my God sent his angel and shut the lions. So he says, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Wow. Really interesting. Because Daniel knew how he was. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. How great is that? And it ends, we're close to the end, it says, then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. We see pictures all the time of this, right? Daniel laying with the lions, petting their manes, and all these things. We see that. So the king knew he couldn't do anything about the decree, but he's furious now. Now he's upset with what these men did, because they, in a sense, blackmailed him. They did something that he wasn't thinking right. And brings us 24, and this is what we see, the accuser's fate. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel and cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all the bones and pieces before they came to the bottom of the den. It just shows how bad it was. Brethren, when we look at this, what we understand without a doubt is that, you know, all these men here, everything that's happening here, that when it says children and wives and all the men of the family, so what they're getting at is they're trying to get rid of their lineage. Totally get rid of it. And that's what we see. And I know it goes on to verse 28. I'll let you guys read that, 25, 28. You can go home and do so. This is a wonderful story because we see once again the perseverance for God, you know, keeping Him first and foremost, even no matter what's going on in our lives, no matter where it's at. And we see we want Him to be first. And that's what we find. And He's willing to take care of us, get us through things. And that's what we see. So any comments or questions? Sorry for so much speed right there at the end. But nope, we're going to finish there. All right, thank you. Appreciate everybody.
We had 3 in class. I don't know if you wanted to count.
Oh, okay, all right. I appreciate it. That'll work. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody knows.
Let me see. Slideshow. From the beginning.